Hello, everyone. I hope you're all having a fantastic day so far. Today, I want to talk about the emergency budget, the emergency spring budget that was announced today by Rachel Reeves, who is the Secretary of State for our finances. Okay, so the Exchequer, I think they call it. Now, I'm not an expert within this space, but again, I enjoy talking about this stuff and learning about this stuff to help you guys either better understand it or help me better understand it, where we can both sort of work it out together. Of course, you can get in the comments and leave your thoughts as well. Now, I want to talk about a few things that I picked up in terms of what was discussed. So I'll talk about what she has said that has been achieved, in addition to, some context and all that kind of jazz there. So for those of you who are not necessarily versed, there was a general election that happened last year. I think it started at the end, no, it was the beginning of May. And Rishi Sunak, who was the Conservative Prime Minister at the time, basically called for a general election. And I think it was July 6th or 7th or something to that effect. Labour won with Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. And so what ended up happening was, obviously they needed to prepare for what was known as the autumn budget. So there are two budgets that exist. There's the autumn budget and the spring budget. And of course, the autumn budget is seen as the real budget, so to speak, because that's where a lot of the bigger changes happen, so to speak. With that in mind, there are a few things that were mentioned in that autumn budget. One of them being that there were going to be what are deemed as fiscal rules. And I need my notes to sort of like remind me of what those different things included. Now, essentially, there was a stability rule and an investment rule. So what that stability rule looked like was ensuring that actually the day-to-day spending, the revenue expenses will rely fully on tax revenue. Okay, so money made from taxes, as opposed to money made from sort of like debt, taking out debt. Now, it's interesting because there's this whole idea, I think it's called, I forgot what the sort of like theory is, but there was a guy in YouTube who put down in my comments like something to research, and I opened this whole world. But essentially, there is this whole idea that actually, whether you borrow money or not, and if you're a country that is sort of like the arbiter of that currency, for example, the pound, the US dollar, etc., etc., then really like you can just create money. So there's no real thing as debt, but really taxes are used to sort of like manage inflation and all this kind of stuff there. So there's a whole question there in itself. But anyway, moving forward, the whole aim was to not basically spend our money or spend the things that we want to fund based on debt, but fully based on taxes. Okay. And then there was also this other rule that stated that net debt must fall as a share of GDP by the end of the forecast. So essentially basically saying they want to minimize and or get rid of the debt. That's what they want to do. And so when we think about all of this stuff, we start to understand that actually the activity and changes that have come into place aim to fit those fiscal rules. And there's a question. Should things be done based on trying to entertain and fit that structure, fit those rules? Or are there some things that actually, really and truly, regardless of these fiscal rules, they need to be acknowledged and they need to be prioritized, they need to be addressed, so to speak? So that's something to think about as I'm saying all this stuff. Now, I want to talk about what she said she achieved. By the way, and I'll remember to do this, I'll try to remember to do this, you can actually get the transcript of what she actually said. And if you want to really analyze it, you can do it that way. So I'll put the transcript below. And yeah, you can check it out for yourself. But essentially, she said that what has been achieved is that there has been economic stability. So she claims that she's restored public finances, allowing the Bank of England to cut interest rates 3 times since the general election. So she's saying that is down to her. Okay, so again, the Bank of England can determine whether that is the case or not. But that's what she's saying. The second thing is NHS progress. So claims, the NHS investment is doing well, and that waiting lists are falling for 5 consecutive months, and there are 2 million more appointments. Again, I haven't fact checked this stuff because I just haven't had time, so you can check that on the NHS website if you want. I think another thing that she probably won't say is progress, as an achievement, but probably is to many parties within the government, is the fact that the Quango slash arm's length body, you could argue, NHS England, is not being commissioned anymore and actually is being absorbed into the Department of Health and Social Care. Then there's also paying living standards. So has stated that there's been an increase to national living wage impacting 3 million people, and the OBR projects average households to be £500 better off, according to Rachel Reeves. Now, just a caveat here. In terms of increased national living wage, it's not increased yet. I believe it should increase in the next couple of days. So it will increase, and it will, or is projected to impact 3 million different people. And so I think it's increased to £12.21. And of course, although this is good for individuals who, require minimum wage or in jobs that, pay minimum wage, this is more sort of like pressure on organizations that are employing these individuals. And it's not necessarily the bigger organizations, it's the smaller ones that are just getting by. The other thing stated is that there is tax enforcement, so raise an additional 6.5 billion from tax evasion measures, with plans to bring that to 7.5 billion by 2030. And the way she said she was going to do that is by working with HMRC to ensure they have the right technological advancements to ensure that at least 20% of those individuals or organizations that do tax evasion are sort of like caught, essentially. Of course, just to be clear, tax evasion is an illegal offense in the sense that you're choosing not to pay tax, which is different to tax efficiency, which is using the system to ensure that you have the right level of taxation given your setup within your organization, business, etc., etc. So that's the distinction there. There's also this talk about defense modernization, okay? And there was a lot of talk on defense. It made me feel a bit uneasy in a way, mainly because, her argument is that the world is changing and everything else. I mean, the world's been changing forever, and that there has to be this move towards increasing our defense by 2.5% of our GDP. GDP, gross domestic product, is just essentially the amount of money that we have, I believe. Okay. But the 2.5% is, I think, a figure that is sort of like the minimum wage in terms of what you would expect to see in the defense budget with any country. And this was triggered by the fact that actually Donald Trump pushed for this, saying that he's not contributing any more money towards defense because Europe collectively are not paying up. And actually they were paying way less compared to what the 500 billion or so that the US was paying. And so they're looking to commit 2.5% in terms of their defense budget, which means that it's adding roughly 6.4 billion by 2027 and 2.2 billion next year. So there's that was mentioned as well. But I think the reason why I focus on the defense element is because there was a lot of talk in potential jobs being available within defense and contracts. I think I actually wrote it down. I was surprised that a Labour minister actually used the word contract. She said there would be more jobs and contracts available via the whole defense thing. And I'm paraphrasing here, and I would love to find the sort of like page, but I don't want to mess up the flow of my notes here. So that's interesting. She recognizes that there is that element as well when it comes to work. But I know she's not necessarily talking about the fact that this is necessarily going to be, the big four and all this kind of stuff there. There is more of a push for smaller consultants, smaller contractors to get involved within this space. And of course, she also mentions the fact that there is going to be growth reform. So the OBR, so the I forgot what they stand for, and I can check that a bit later on. But the OBR, basically the sort of like office that determines like the reporting and the statistics. So the Office for Budget Responsibility, that's what it is. And essentially they do forecasts. And what a lot of these governments do, or shadow governments do, is that they use the OBR's figures and they work with them to basically plan for the future. And so some stats here. So the OBR has validated that planning reforms will boost GDP by 0.2% by 2029 and 0.4% by 2034. So what she's recognizing this as the biggest non-fiscal policy boost ever recognized, meaning that this boost has come from the fact that actually didn't need money to generate money, so to speak. So she's trying to show sort of like creation of positive gains. I also wanted to talk about her aims. And why? Because, well, she mentioned them in her speech. And so she's calling this the decade of national renewal. Okay. And essentially what she's saying is that, number one, there needs to be some sort of investment into defense, public services and infrastructure. So we've already seen what that means in terms of defense, in terms of a percentage of GDP. And that makes me feel like we're just gearing up for war. There's going to be more jobs available, more this, more that, X, Y, and Z. Yes, it's important to make sure that you have a good defenses set up. And I think she she labeled it as being we wanted to be a country that was a super military and or defense complex. I think those were the words, to some effect or degree. And I'm just like, interesting. Is that on your own? Because on your own, we wouldn't be enough. With Europe, maybe something, but still against, and I'm not saying there'd be anything against the likes of the USA, but when you've got the firing power of the USA, and then you've got the man and woman power of China and all these other places, it becomes quite interesting. So I guess this is almost like an attempt to be serious, to be taken seriously. But I don't know if this is like, haha, I know something you don't know sort of energy. It makes me feel a bit uncomfortable. Anyway, there's also this drive towards economic productivity and innovation. And of course, it's in the name, they're Labour. They consistently and continually talk about the working person, working people. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, let's be logical here. Working people are people who are working, right? Who sits outside of that? So on one side, those people who are unemployed, and that would include individuals who are students, who are learning, people who are not able to get onto the job ladder or develop a career. All of those different people. And on the other side, is she classing those individuals with businesses as not working? How is that defined? Does self-employment sit there? And if so, is there a certain bracket for bigger organizations or bigger businesses versus smaller ones? It would lead me to suggest that actually, when she's saying working person, anyone that's contributing to national insurance and income tax, and therefore there is a bit of a grey area. So that does look at people who are working and also those who are inside of IR35. And then there's a bit of grace for those who are working outside of IR35 as consultants and contractors, just because they don't make the big gains such as these medium to larger enterprises. So that's what I think when it comes to that stuff. So she wants to drive for productivity and innovation. And innovation has been spoken about by Peter Carr, who is the Secretary of State for Science, Technologies and Innovation. Okay, so this is where there is a bit more of a push to make the state more efficient. So this is where the cuts are coming into play and all this kind of stuff there. But if you come back to what I was saying before about the fiscal rules in terms about economic stability, are they just trying to like fit the circle in the whole sort of thing so that it fits, as opposed to doing this whole thing of doing it because it benefits the country? So that's something to think about. So tackling the legacy of what she alleges was conservative fiscal mismanagement. So we've heard about this whole 22 billion black hole. And let me give you some context. I think the spending power of the UK is roughly 1.2 trillion. 1.2 trillion. I think that's like 1,000 billion. I think that is. So when you hit the 6 billions, the 22 billions, the this and that, it's minuscule when it comes to the amount that they can actually spend. And that doesn't necessarily talk to the fact that they can create money. Now, of course, they're not trying to create money via the Bank of England and the central reserves because of the fiscal rules, but they have been borrowing money or they were borrowing money at the beginning of the government. And so that's something to note. That's something to state. Of course, there's been some reshuffling. So, for example, I think it was recently there was roughly a negative 4 point odd % deficit, i.e., debt management that needed to be sort of like managed, and some reshuffling of the sort of like state of affairs in terms of changes to welfare and everything else has meant that actually there is now positive 9.9 billion headroom. Okay, essentially what I'm saying is things have been. It looks like things have been changed, fiddled, maneuvered, whatever it may be, to fit this headroom that needs to exist. And I think they don't want any references, but to what end? How much pressure is going to be on the system? Is making things leaner, okay, going to actually work in a country that doesn't necessarily have the infrastructure to enable that? To say that you need to, or like all these different sort of like government departments need to go ahead and think about AI for their departments and stuff. I mean, yeah, great sort of like not mandate, but I guess what I'm basically saying is that you don't even know what they're going to be doing. You have no idea of what they're going to be doing and whether they're actually going to enforce this stuff. So we'll see what happens. Anyway, I'm kind of like stumbling over my words because I'm trying to make a point out of something that I've already made a point about. So next thing is the next aim is building resilience in a volatile global economy. So obviously we've been impacted by a lot of stuff such as the war in Ukraine, rising borrowing costs, and also decline in trade stability. We've seen the whole tariff wars and everything else. We've seen the breakdown of different, I'm going to say global forums or continental forums or whatever it may be. Brexit is an example of one of them and all this kind of jazz there. So that means we have to be more resilient than ever. This is what this essentially means. And so when we think about it, and we look at sort of like the outlook and everything else, there was almost like an economic outlook that she spoke about in terms of what the Office for Budget Responsibility mentioned. So in terms of their planning, so they forecasted GDP growth of 2% autumn of 2024, but as of March 2025 is 1%. So what does that actually mean? There was an overestimation in terms of growth when it comes to where we would be right now in terms of like the economic outlook, and it's currently 1%. Why is that the case? Is that purely because of global affairs, or is that because of some of the changes that have happened within this Labour government? What do you guys think? It'd be great to know. Also mentions here that growth rebounds moderately from 2026 to 2029. So these are planned figures, by the way, with annual projections between 1.7% to 1.9%. Okay. So there's a lot of these percentages flying about. And if you look at Sky News, they do a great chart showing what that specifically looks like. So this initial 2% that they projected is not even going to be met. It's not even going to be met. So it's dancing around this whole 1.7% and 1.9%, bearing in mind we're currently 1%. So she's hoping that there is going to be some level of growth. But from where? So far, it looks like this growth, okay, is coming from taxes, but also from efficiency gains when it comes from cutting benefits, okay, so impacting the most vulnerable within our society. More specifically, the health element of the benefits package in order to encourage people to go to work. But how can you encourage people to go to work that can't work? How do you do that, Rachel Reeves? I don't understand. So make me understand. There's also talk from the OBR in terms of, I've jumped the gun a little bit, but it's just, it's triggering to a degree, for people who actually need support. And of course, there's the flip side where people will say, well, there are some people who are taking advantage of the system. And really and truly, there needs to be a way to tackle this. And I'm just wondering how it's going to be tackled. How do you differentiate between those individuals who are gaming the system, okay, whether they are inherent to this country or not, and those people who genuinely need it? That's the big question. Because even though there's this fancy talk, okay, about this cut, that cut, growth, this, that, what does it mean for people in general? What does it mean for people in general? So here, there's a point about inflation remains sticky in the short term. So CPI inflation projected to an average of 3.2%. So CPI just stands for Consumer Price Index, which is basically based on a group of different items and products that determine sort of like fluctuations in their prices, which give us an idea in terms of what inflation looks like. Okay, and inflation is really the rate of change at which products rise in their price or fall in their price. Okay, so that hopefully that understands. And it says here that there is an aim for it to fall to 2.1%. So from 3.2% in 2025 to 2.1% in 2026. And it's predicted that long-term target of 2% inflation expected to be achieved by 2027. Again, we'll see if that happens. What was also interesting, and this is something for you guys to know, she stated that real household disposable income is expected to grow twice as fast as previously forecasted, with households on average £500 better off. So if you end up having £500 more in your account, I don't know if this is at the end of their government or next year, then just note it. Just let me know if that happens. Do you think that will actually happen? So let's keep it moving. So the things I want to sort of like highlight and talk about is the welfare reforms element of things and employment policy. So key big changes that have been mentioned here. So health element of universal credit will be cut by 50% for new claimants and then frozen. So that would insinuate that anyone who has benefits with this health element attached to it are not going to get any changes to their current arrangement, but any new claimants will not have the same sort of benefits in that way in terms of the health element side of things, where 50% of it will be cut and then frozen at a certain point. There's also this fact that universal credit standard allowance will rise from £92 per week to £106 per week by 2029 to 2030. And £1 billion has been allocated to personalised job support and £400 million to enhance the Department of Work and Pensions job centre operations. So this is expected to create a net savings of $3.4 billion despite rising disability claims. Now, let's pause on that for a second. There's a lot of things that I said. The health element side of things is very techy, okay? Now, I'm guessing that a lot of people are going on long-term sickness because of the fact that they're suffering from deep mental health conditions. Whether this is depression, okay? And clinical depression is defined by low mood for at least 2 weeks. Some people are like, I've been depressed all this time. Yeah, you probably have. There are high levels of anxiety. There are different elements of neurodivergence that exist in terms of how people are able to process information, you know? And so with all of this in mind, there have been triggering points that have created this catalyst for an increase in long-term health and sickness, okay? Whether this is physical and or mental. And so, of course, yeah, there are people who game the system, but there are legitimate people who are feeling it. Some of the stuff is related to cost of living, pressures in their family, the ability to afford and fund their lifestyles. And so I say this to say, rising the universal credit allowance from £92 to £106, which is an increase of roughly £14. Yeah, I mean, every little helps sort of thing, but there's a gap in terms of the health element side of stuff. And relying on the Department of Work and Pensions to essentially support people to get work is interesting. Are they going to have specialists for every single type of profession? I speak about portfolio careers all the time, you creating your career. And so how can someone help you in that space? Because portfolio careers are not just about entrepreneurship and business and all this kind of stuff there. It's also about 9 to 5 permanent roles, all of that kind of stuff there. So I just wonder whether 1 billion will cut it and whether this actual reform makes sense. Yes, it's saving money for the country as a whole, but this form of cost cutting, which is being defined as austerity, but Labour will never say it is, is interesting to say the least. So essentially, it seems like these welfare reforms are aimed to encourage people to work. This is where the growth is coming from, okay? But inadvertently, what's quite interesting is that we have employers' national insurance increasing from 13.8% to 15%. And so, what may end up happening, especially with the increase in minimum wage, is that enterprises, organizations, businesses, big, small, medium, there may be more pressure to employ new people, especially people who are, in their first jobs, junior by nature, first time roles, all of that kind of stuff there. There will be an increase to bring in things like AI or for other individuals to take on more work, which is definitely going to increase some sort of mental health crisis, burnout, all of this kind of stuff there, and push people away from employment and possibly be unemployed or self-employed, whether that looks like contracting, consulting, their own business, etc., etc. But I'm not saying this like it's an easy thing. It's difficult to do that because we know already more than 90% of people fail when it comes to their business in the first 1 to 5 years anyway. And so I'm saying there is a knock-on effect that could happen, which inadvertently means that more people may be on benefits. So the plan kind of has to work. It's a huge risk that's being sort of like made here. So there's a real threat, especially when you've got your ministers who have it as their main task to increase innovation, AI, technology. So I'm a bit confused. I'm just hoping there's a grand plan here that I've possibly missed. And I'm hoping the culture and there is optimism behind actually achieving what we aim to achieve. Anywho, let's go to defense. So when it comes to the whole defense element, defense spending to hit roughly 2.5% GDP, as I mentioned before, with ambitions to make it 3% longer term. I know the Conservative government want to make it 3% now because they think that's what needs to be done. There's going to be an additional 2.2 billion to the Ministry of Defense for April onwards, and 400 million budget ring fence for defense innovation. So this is going to include things like computerization, drones, AI, advanced manufacturing, all of this kind of stuff there. So there's also going to be creation of a defense growth board. I find that interesting. A defense growth board. So this board, who's going to sit on that board, for one? I'd love to know. What are their sort of like political intentions? Where do they sit on the political axis? What are the goals of the growth board? Because I say this to say, like, it's great to have defense. It's really important. But we shouldn't incite or encourage war. We should not do that because there are a lot of people. It's not even they're not ready to go. They will not go to war. They will not even be involved in that way. So I say this to say that there's been a lot of focus on that, like I said before, and there will be jobs available within this space. But this may be a conflict in terms of like interest for some individuals who may not want to be involved in defense and development of all of that kind of stuff there, which is understandable. Everyone can do what they want to do. There's also stuff centered around housing, planning, and growth. Okay, so essentially, and before I get into it, she stated that it was recognized by the Office for Budget Responsibility that actually the Labour government, the way they're setting their plans out, is more likely going to hit the 300,000 homes that need to be built. I don't know if it's each year, but just need to be built at least anyway. As currently we're not on track for that. Interesting. We'll see if that's the case. So planning reforms will contribute to 0.4% GDP by 2034, which is equivalent to £15.1 billion. Projected house building of 305,000 homes per year by the end of the forecast, so a 40-year high according to her. 1.3 million homes over 5 years. will be built with the potential to deliver the manifesto pledge of 1.5 billion. This is something that Keir Starmer spoke about when he first entered office. 2 billion for social affordable homes, creating 18,000 units, and 600 million to train 60,000 construction workers and fund 10 new technical colleges. So okay, cool. So the technical colleges will create jobs. It is sort of like going to be, I guess, contributing to skill development and learning, which is good. And of course, 60,000 construction workers. Be interesting to see how many of those construction workers are from Britain and UK focused. We'll see what happens there, really. So again, this is state-led stimuli in terms of money via housing. So there is a lot of economic activity in terms of pushing the housing agenda. And apparently the OBR are on board in terms of their projections. Okay, we'll see where we go from there. So public sector efficiency and technology. Now this is interesting. 3.25 billion for a transformation fund created to modernize government services. So this is what I was talking about before in terms of getting public sector organizations to be more modernized in terms of their approach to things. And of course, this is all centered around AI, changing their infrastructure, having less of a workforce. So you want to get people working more, but you also know that there is a need for AI, or there is a want for AI. So the question then becomes the rate at which, so how many jobs does AI replace potentially? And how many jobs are created based on the changes made by this government? And what is the deficit? What is the gap? That'd be interesting. I personally, I don't think there's enough going around to support individuals who need work. But again, I might be wrong. I'm only looking at it from a public sector government standpoint. But of course, inadvertently, that affects what the private sector does to a degree, because the private sector will see gaps in the market, and or there will be procurements that contribute to delivering on public sector services as well. So there is this push for this whole public sector efficiency element to get AI tools in justice and public administration areas. There's going to be an encouragement of voluntary exit schemes to reduce civil service size. So again, what other jobs are they going to be doing, Rachel? That's what I want to know. And then foster care support investments. So the goal is to save 6.1 billion in day-to-day spending by 2029-2030. So essentially, she's trying to push this whole leaner tech-enabled state, which feels good. I just want to know what other people are going to be doing. Is this, I don't know, it's very World Economic Forum-esque. Again, I'm sure there's a lot of different countries across the world who are following a similar trajectory, especially if they're more on a certain stance. So we'll see what happens there. So there are some other things I want to mention. I just want to make sure that I've covered some stuff, because I got like two different like sort of like sources of information that I'm currently gathering. So we've currently got strategic positioning and narrative. So here I've got there's this whole idea of an active government rather than a laissez-faire one, and this is the decade of national renewal. Obviously getting ahead of themselves in terms of the decade element. And there is, again, repeated focus on security. Okay. So economic security, national security, and social security. But the focus is heavily on working people as the policy reference throughout the whole speech. Working people, working people, working people. So it's important to understand what that specifically means. There's a question whether this is a technocratic repositioning, i.e. focus on the technical as opposed to the social elements and or the financial elements. So yeah, it's interesting to see where we'll go with all of this stuff. Now, here are just some additional sort of like thoughts that come to mind. And I think in my mind, I'm just thinking to myself, how does this affect just general people? Like, what does this actually mean? I mean, I've written a few questions here in terms of, the aim is to put working people first. What does this actually mean? There's talks of, ensuring that there is better HMRC technology to ensure that there is minimal tax evasion and all this kind of jazz there. There's some other things that have been mentioned. In fact, I'm not going to go through these questions because it's getting confusing. I think I want to round up and basically say that there is a lot there in this spring budget. I feel like that a lot of this has been done in order to ensure that fiscal rules have been met. Fiscal rules that she created. There's a lot of heavy reliance on the OBR in terms of planning. But the reality is we don't know what's happening tomorrow. We don't even know what's happening in the next hour. Okay, you can plan for it, which is great. But again, the OBR planned for 2% growth, but actually is 1%. Now, it could still be 2% by the end of the year, but that's unlikely. Because we don't have much time. So the point being made is like, it doesn't mean anything. What does mean something, though, is the actual cuts that have been made. Okay, or the actual injections. So we know there are cuts to benefits, the health element of it at least anyway, and then it'll be frozen. They're on after for new claimants. We know that there is an injection of cash for 60,000 different individuals who will be trained up via 10 technical colleges to produce 305,000 homes. We know that there has been a cut to the state in terms of the public sector, whether it comes to quangos, arm's length bodies, departments, etc., etc. And there is a push to make sure that there are efficiencies within every department. So we know these things. But the question is, does it help you, the person? Do you believe it will help you find the job that you need? Do you believe that it will change the outlook and the feel of the country? Do you believe that you will feel happier as a return in terms of some of the things that she's mentioned? That's the question. That's the actual question. Who do you think this actually favors and benefits? Because apparently it's favoring the working person. And maybe like your response may not be in a government-esque sort of like tone. But in the same vein, you'll know what you want. Most people just want to make sure that they can live life the way they want to live. And if that's too ambitious, they just want to be able to afford their life. They just want to be able to afford their life with no stress, no drama, no unnecessary legalese or no unnecessary strain or stress. And they just want to be supported to be the best that they can be. Okay? And that looks different for every single person. I might do a video in this. I believe there is a silent rise in the permanent member of staff, actually, because of the fact there is an understood perception in terms of safety and benefits and progression and, sort of like the goals aimed to achieve. And I think it's very valid, I think the reason why I picked the whole portfolio career element is because I recognize that everyone's journey is going to look different. We can still work together, but everyone's journey is going to look different. Hence why I'm not like Bible bashing a 9-to-5 or an entrepreneur or this or that, etc., etc. We all need to contribute in some way, shape, or form. So that was my interpretation of the spring budget. I might do a more consolidated one where you can see more figures and stuff if I have the time and energy. But let me know your thoughts below. Do you think it was a good spring budget? Do you think it was expected? Do you think we can actually meet the growth? What does that actually mean for the average person? Is it just efficiency cuts? Is it just trying to fit the fiscal rules so we have the headroom to spend money and spend money based on the taxes that we pay into? Or is it something else? She promises that taxes won't increase, but may we see something different in October, in the autumn budget? Who knows? She also wants to make sure that there is one sort of like budget announcement each year, which is interesting actually. And for me, that feels like there is less accountability. And I'm guessing she's probably thinking about how the markets react and respond to budget sort of like announcements, which again makes it suspicious. Yeah, interesting times ahead, but I'd love to know your thoughts. I don't think there's anything else from my standpoint. I don't think there is. There's probably something I've missed, but hey ho spaghetti, yeah. I said everything I can. And that's it. If you want to see more videos centered around portfolio careers, soft economics, things centered around, yeah, just moving forward in life, with the current state of the UK at the moment. Then don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And as always, my friends, understand, reach, and expand. Peace.